Hi there, I'm Mike Price, here with Sumter Bruton for the Fort Worth Public Library Jazz Archives with another installment of Jazz Perspectives. I think we're here to talk about the history of jazz in Fort Worth, but I mean, how do you narrow that down to
Well, it's hard to do because it's jazz in Fort Worth. I think a lot of it started with Western Swing, which is the birthplace of Western Swing.
Yeah, precisely.
And everybody in those bands who played the stringed instruments were basically jazz players. In fact, Bob Dunn was maybe the first electric guitar on record was done here in Fort Worth, and he was playing a very advanced jazz guitar at the time.
He was out of a horn band background too, playing Dixieland.
Right.
And so
he had played trombone, and he kind of came out of, I think he put the trombone ideas onto steel guitar.
the steel guitar, the slide trombone goes into the steel guitar, slide guitar. Pretty amazing stuff. Your pedigree, for want of a better word, comes from a practical background in playing as well as an interest in studying the music. Why don't you give us a little rundown on what the Bruton family has been up to here over the long haul?
My father was a jazz drummer, a left-handed drummer. He always liked to be sure everybody knew that he was a left-handed drummer.
That'd be Sumter Jr.
yeah, he was Thomas Sumter Bruton Jr. from New Jersey, and he ended up here at World War II, which, you know, people moved around during the war, and ended up moved to Fort Worth, at Tarrant Field.
Yeah.
Married a girl from Granbury.
Right.
And anyway, he played drums, but he didn't play drums during the war. He was basically sergeant at the Air Force Base, and we moved back to New Jersey after the war, and he went back to working at the DuPont plant and playing, of course, drums again. That's the first music I remember hearing him do is his band, which was kind of a big band. They worked at Atlantic City and all that.
Yeah.
Of course, he had a great collection of records. I remember I couldn't read yet, but I knew that, you know, Count Basie and Pete Johnson were on a blue label, and Stan Kenton was on an orange label. And in the middle of the night, I'd wake up and go put on these 78s and wake up my parents. They called me Bebop for the first couple of years. I was like 2 to 4 because I was playing along with, Benny Goodman and Pete Johnson and Count Basie. He moved back down here in what year was it? Probably the early 50s. We moved back up there like 46. I was born here.
Yes.
And he came back here and played at night. He went to college, back to school on the GI Bill, and was working 6 nights a week. Went to college, graduated in 2.5 years with 1 C. Everything was straight A, you know, it was pretty amazing. And opened up the record store in '57, which has been there for 49 years.
That's Record Town.
Record Town. It'll be our 50th year this coming year. You know, back in probably the late 50s, early 60s is really when it was, because the record stores were still just record stores. There weren't any, you had to go to a record, you had to go to a record store.
Right.
Sometimes some drugstores had some cheap records, but they'd come in with the listening booths back at the back, and people would go back there and their girlfriends and listen to Johnny Mathis and Bobby Blue Bland. Yeah. And it kept going, and it's the business has changed though so much. It's still okay, but it's not the same as it was. Sure. It's just it's like a lot of other business. It's just things change. So
50 years.
It'll be 50 February 1st, I think.
Wow. Nice work if you can get it. How old were you, Sumter, when you realized that Fort Worth, being your native city, had kind of a jazz heritage all its own?
Well, I guess going to see my dad and them play. Him and Leon Breeden, who started the North Texas State. He didn't really start it, but he really got it.
Very instrumental in
getting back on the road after World War II. And he was playing with Leon and Jim Eckert and Alan Snodgrass and John Hawkins, who was a bass player. He learned to play at the old Jim Hotel when he was a kid. He'd sneak in there in the late 30s, early 40s, and listen to T-Bone's bass player and learn from them. So these cats were good these were good musicians. Yeah. They were like, Oscar Peterson style piano trio, quintet, quartet, whatever the band called for. So I just, I was around these good players, and I just go out and see them whenever I could.
You started playing kind of late bloomer in the.
Right.
Your brother Stephen actually had started much earlier.
Stephen started during the big folk scare.
And Stephen is what, 4 or 5 years younger than?
4 years and a week younger.
Okay.
He started the Kingston Trio period.
What brought you into playing?
Well, I was 17, and I went to a frat rush party.
Yeah.
And it was, a lot of beer was flowing. Had a real good black band playing there, and I never had seen a really good blues band in person. I've seen jazz bands, and I saw a little Al the High Fives, I think it was. And I went home that night and told Steven, I said, I need to borrow one of your guitars, and I got to learn how to play guitar. Like, that night, And so he gave me one the next day and showed me 2 chords. And he said, you can figure out the 3rd chord on your own. For the blues.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he took me 2, so that's how I started. But I've been listening to that stuff
of course.
Since I was 3 or 4 years old. 4 years old, yeah. And I just decided I needed to play it too.
Yeah, I know. I've been there. I got
right.
A little
Same thing. Yeah, right. I went off to college with a Miles Davis album and a T-Bone Walker album and a B.B. King album. I figured between those 3, it's a pretty good combination. Kinda Blue was a new album. I put it like that, and then it just come out.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. What's your preferred instrument? Guitar.
A Gibson.
Any particular?
Oh, I like the fat ones because the big ones, the big L5s and 350s and that. But I got Les Paul sounds great. 335. So I never have liked the Fenders. They were. I just thought the guys that play those were wimpy. I hate to say it. They're just a lot of. The guys I was listening to were like Wayne Bennett and B.B. King and Freddie King, and they were all big men with big guitars, and they had a big sound.
Yes.
And you can't get that sound through. I guess you can, but I through a Fender, I never could do it.
Actually, the combination of a well-played Fender and a well-played Gibson is kind of hard to beat. But given the choice, I'll err on the side of Gibson.
Yeah, the Fenders were just a little bit thin for me.
I never developed much taste for the electric or ability with it, but my acoustic preference is a Gibson Kalamazoo, and. Big guitar, big sound.
Right.
And what are you going to do with that?
Right.
Where, assuming you've ever done so, I think I've got kind of an idea, but where does jazz in Fort Worth begin?
That's a good question. In Fort Worth, you can say New Orleans and Chicago, you get better answers. Right. There were bands like, people forget about Ray McKinley and Tex Beneke were out of Fort Worth.
Were playing jazz
and they
before anybody knew who they were.
Right. They went on to play with Glenn Miller and their own bands.
Their own outfits, yeah.
And the black jazz scene wasn't much known about it till probably the late 40s. And then all of a sudden it started really popping up. It may have been around, but you just didn't know about it.
Sure.
But again, the Western swing guys had a big influence on jazz in Fort Worth. There's a ton of great guitar players and fiddle players and steel players and piano players. The guy that did 12th Street?
Uday Bowman.
Yeah, for Fort Worth.
Uday Bowman, who composed 12th Street Rag.
12th Street Rag.
As early as what? Was that 1914, I think?
A long time ago. I don't know.
Conventional wisdom, of course, says that the birth of Western swing occurred one night in either the winter of 1929 or the early part of 1930, when Bob Wills's fiddle band got a sit-in from this cigar salesman named Milton Brown.
Right.
And Bob himself once described that scene to me. He couldn't pin down the date because they weren't keeping score as to memorable occasions. He said this city slicker walked in. So he looked like what was Bob's word? He said he looked like a jelly bean, dressed up like Humphrey Bogart. He says, can I sit in with you guys? Okay. And it was Milton Brown, and the song that he wanted to do was St. Louis Blues.
Right.
And of course the combination clicked, and the next thing you know, this Will's Fiddle Band is going to work for the Burris Mills as the Light Crust Doughboys. Right. And of course that's an oversimplification of the process. But
well, it's the piano players, was listening to Milton. Fred Calhoun was listening to a lot of Dixieland, of course, was listening to Dixieland, and Bob had grown up listening to blues. Everything in Fort Worth is going to be blues-oriented. This town everybody that's come out of this town, from Bob Wills to Delbert to Ornette Coleman to King Curtis to T-Bone, blues is the basis to it all, to everything, and it really is. It's basic. Well, Texas, the whole state's like that, but Fort Worth is even more so.
Texas has got a blues history that I've always felt rivals that of any of the more readily acknowledged starting points. Although, what distinguishes Texas blues from, say, Mississippi?
It's different. The Texas blues players, the guitar players played a lot more single string, like horn lines.
Right.
And the Mississippi guys played more of a chord type thing. And the guys in Texas were more single string, and they were just, you had to be real good. Because there were a lot of good lead guitar players. And the cream, you know, raised to the top of the head was you had to be a hot player to make it in this town, or just Texas, period. And most guys that could play blues played jazz too. The Western swing guys all played jazz.
Oh, man,
all the blues guys were trying to play jazz, and the jazz guys, of course, were listening to the blues.
Well, you listen to that record that Zuzu Ballin did in Dallas in the early 50s, Why Don't You Eat Where You Slept Last Night?
Right.
They're playing bebop.
Right.
It's over their heads, but they're playing bebop.
Well, that's just part
and
of
that's
the
I'd
influence.
rather hear a band stretch than hear it do
Right.
something it's perfectly comfortable with. Where did T-Bone get his style, apart from what he invented?
Well, I asked him that same question once. He said he listened to Lonnie Johnson a lot, of course, who was a lead player,
Very
just
much.
a single string, and he listened to Charlie Christian. Him were good friends.
Right.
They both took from the same guitar teacher, which is kind of a weird, kind of a scary thought. Somebody named Hamilton in Dallas.
Wow.
And I wonder who the heck he was, you know. But they both took lessons from this Mr. Hamilton. And he listened to Lionel Jefferson, of course, was a big Texas guy out of Wortham. And so those are the main three things, but he, you know, everybody was plugging in at the same time. Everybody was, the country guys were plugging their guitars in, trying to get, you know, an amplification. The blues guys doing the same thing. Some of the first amps ever made were made in Mineral Wells, Texas, which is never thought of as one of the first amp. Amp called Volutone.
Sure.
Is the name of it. And Bob Dunn's got one on that Milton Brown album cover. It looked like a little radio.
It looked like a little old,
about this tall. With looked like a piece of furniture almost.
It looks, it looks like the later Rickenbacker.
So T-Bone was listening to that, and he plugged in, and I don't know if he was playing amplified at the Gym Hotel or not. I've asked people, and they don't remember for sure. He may have been, but it was such, at the time, especially the mid-30s, they were having to make this stuff up on the, you know, go. They would get a record player needles and put it in their guitar and get the sound to come through like a cartridge type thing. And Bob Dunn's first steel guitar, he had to get an electromagnet and rub it down the strings before he played it because there was no magnetic pickup yet.
Right.
But they were figuring out how to do this stuff, and around at the end of the 30s, it was happening, you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
up
they
to
had
then,
all pretty well plugged in by that time.
but then all of a sudden, all the horn players hit in Texas. There was, you know, there was tons of guitar players and piano players.
And piano players.
Because Boogie Woogie basically, I want to say, started in Texas too, not in Fort Worth, but East Texas. They have the logging, the camps, the logging
Certainly the
communities.
boogie players, yeah, and the
They
the
call it
barrel
Fast
house.
Texas.
Right.
The name of it.
Exactly. I worked with Robert Shaw, the barrel house player from Austin, during the last several years of his life, and with Whistling Alex Moore over in Dallas. Man, it's like, where did this boogie woogie come from? Certainly didn't. Well, the phenomenon came out of New York, but the music came out of the Texas and the general Deep South.
Basically, the logging communities. They
Exactly.
always had a piano out there.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much else to do except, you know, fight and play piano, I guess. You know, it's tough out there.
Carouse and listen to music. Yeah, it's nice to have a self-contained orchestra. But what was your first attempt at developing a guitar style of your own? Where were you heading in that?
Well, I was, you know, listening, like I said, went up to college with the B.B. King album and a T-Bone album and the Miles Davis Kind of Blue album.
1962.
And of course, Freddie King was real popular, but I listened to Kenny Burrell and Wes Montgomery and all those, Herb Ellis, who's from up here just north of Fort Worth, Farmersville, or one of those little towns up there. And Barney Kessel from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And just listen to all those guys, and all of them are really bluesy players. Yeah. So I was just listening to them, you know, and just trying to copy it the best you could. And I wasn't the only person. There was, you know, there was a lot of, that period of time, a lot of the white kids are really getting into black rhythm and blues, especially in the late 50s and early 60s.
I think you were reaching a little bit farther back in time for your influence.
Well, I was playing a little more jazzy stuff than some of the other guys were, but there were 2 or 3 other players in town doing the same thing I was. They're all dead, right? Bob Jones, Donnie Stevens, great players. Frank Kinman, but of course Frank came out of the West Texas Western Swing School.
Tell me about the connection with T-Bone. You hooked up with him in person about what year?
Well, the year he died, I guess, actually, 74. His godson, Nathan Lewis, was singing with the band I was playing with, and Nathan always tell me, whenever my godfather comes to town, I'll introduce you to him. And I thought Nathan was talked a lot. You know, I didn't believe everything he said.
You knew he was talking about T-Bone.
Yeah, he knew he said T-Bone. So one day I was at the store, I get this phone call and said, Nathan said, I got somebody wants to talk to you. And as soon as I picked it up, it was T-Bone Walker. You could tell by listening to his, it's like his singing voice. Right. So we chatted for a while, and I invited him out to the Bluebird that night where I was playing. And he came out, and he'd had a stroke. Yeah. And his guitar playing was, couldn't even play anymore to speak of. Played piano, matter of fact, that night. And came out there, and the people at the Bluebird were just flipped out that T-Bone Walker is at the Bluebird and everything. So we hung around for a couple of days, and real nice guy, and he was visiting old friends. He knew he wasn't long for the world. Yeah. He was just back visiting. You know, he'd played a job in Pittsburgh, and I think basically one of his last jobs on stage was maybe here in Fort Worth, though he basically played piano. He went back to L.A. and got pneumonia, and he was just, you know, he's only like 64. Yeah. But he was an old 64. You know.
Well, he had lost his friend Mantan Moreland, comedian, had died just about a year before that. Gets feeling alone in the world.
Well, he had half of his stomach taken out in the 40s from an ulcer.
What did you learn from direct contact with T-Bone Walker? What you hadn't picked up by listening to
Well, not much. She showed me one lick that I've been playing for a long time, and I've been playing it wrong, technically. And I said, what is that? And I showed it to him and said, that's an augmented. And the term is augmented.
Of course.
And I didn't want to argue with him about augmented, you know, and I said, okay.
That's a better word.
But he showed me how it was the lick went horizontal, and I had been playing it up and down, vertically. And that was it. It wasn't much to it. And he just showed me that. And I said, oh, it makes sense.
Oh, man.
But he only knew basically 4 or 5 chords. He placed everything out of the ninths.
Everything based out of the ninths.
And that's one reason he was so revolutionary, because nobody was playing ninth chords to speak of yet. Yeah. In minor sevenths, and he did. But he only knew like 4 or 5 chords. I also asked him that I knew he sung that song "I'm Still in Love with You" and all those pretty ballads.
Oh yeah.
And he said, well, when he first started playing, he was playing with bands. They had to play Body and Soul and Stardust and all the pop tunes too. Right. So he grew up singing. It wasn't just blues. He knew all the standards of the day.
He told me when I first met T-Bone about 50. I was a little kid, and you know my uncle had those nightclub connections. When I first met T-Bone, man, what a generous guy. I mean, he talked to you and he told you stuff you needed to know, whether you knew you needed to know it or not. And my uncle had given me a guitar. I was about 8 or 9 years old, and he says, "I want you to learn to play this like T-Bone." I said, "Okay, couldn't you say maybe Gene Autry or something, something easy?" And he said, "No, I want you to listen to these records and see if you can do that, because I'm going to take you out to meet him one of these days." I said, "Oh man, it was like you and his godson." It was like, yeah, right, one of these.
I think he had a lot of godsons. That was just his Fort Worth godson.
Exactly, but when I got to meet him in person, I was just like very easy rapport with the guy, which is obviously the experience you had. He didn't talk down to a kid.
He was a gentleman.
Yes,
That's what Ray
much.
Charles said. He was a true gentleman.
He was a true gentleman. He had that soft-mannered, genteel speaking voice. And I said, gosh, Mr. Walker, my uncle told me he wanted me to learn to play this guitar like you can, and I can't do it. I said, I can imitate your guitar licks on the piano. He says, you just keep on doing what you're doing. Guitar players need piano players.
That's right.
I said, whew, yeah. That's a load off.
Saved by the bell.
And of course, it came in handy when we hooked up, 10 or 15 years ago, and started doing the kind of, not exactly the T-bone material, but material, the influence is so
It's
great.
kind of the way he might do it.
Yeah, and I think the first time I heard you play with the Juke Jumpers, God, is that the ghost of T-Bone Walker? Sure enough, it was pretty close, but very few people.
Well, if Steve Miller could do it in Dallas, Steve Miller's father was, T-Bone's doctor, so he got to meet him a lot when he was a kid.
Yeah.
So he could do it, and a few other guys around here. And
Ray Benson plays a good T-bone lick.
And Duke Robillard.
Duke Robillard. Funny how that stuff endures despite the best efforts of the culture to grind it down.
Right.
But when Fort Worth became the site of Caravan of Dreams, the nightclub, the expressed intention was to create a place that would lure Ornette Coleman back home to Fort Worth for keeps, which, let the record show, it didn't work, although we did get him back for some interesting engagements. But I think the finest long-term effect of having had the Caravan here from 1983 until, 2001 approximately, about 18 years, was that it did call attention to that jazz heritage that a lot of people don't even realize. We've never really discussed this, but what do you think has done the most to create a sense of jazz heritage about this city?
I think it's probably the music teachers at I.M. Terrell. I can't think of all the guys' names, but boy, they sure had a lot of good teachers and students both. I mean, Fort Worth, especially for avant-garde jazz, had probably the most outside players, use that term, come out of this town than any other town in the United States except for Chicago. And Fort Worth's not near as big as Chicago, but you start saying, Ornette and Prince Lasha and Julius Hemphill and Dewey Redman and God, the list goes on. John Carter, who I think actually taught there, then retired, went out on his own. I think it was just a real good, and of course King Curtis went there too.
Yes.
But he didn't play that. He played different,
King
more
Curtis
like Lester Young.
played more of a deep Southern blues soul
But
stuff.
those other guys, they were all came out of that. I guess it's just the teachers there and just listening to each other.
When did Terrell start its jazz or music studies program?
I would know for sure. I would say probably the late 30s, early 40s.
There's a British CD that you turned up at Record Town by a group called the Four Aces.
Right, oh yeah.
And I was reading those liner notes. I said, my gosh, these guys were not only from, I knew they were local, but it's like they came out of I.M. Terrell High School. And how many years did that program endure?
When did I.M. Terrell start? And they may have, they've been in the music department there since the beginning. There was another good horn player, and I was trying to think of his name on the way down here. He worked with, he played with Lionel Hampton. He was the first guy I remember reading about from Fort Worth. And he had a couple of hit records, and he was born in 24. But he was born in Fort Worth, so he would be older than the other guys.
Right.
But he would have been one of the earlier guys. With him there probably the late 30s.
Yeah.
And he played with Lionel Hampton. But I just think that they just had some good teachers out there. And they just had that's a real good question.
Well, they were also working under the doctrine of separate but equal, which was unequal
and
entirely.
A lot of...
And taking advantage of that very
all those guys that played the outside jazz grew up playing rhythm and blues.
Right.
Like Ornette Coleman got to L.A. because he got stranded out there, basically. And Fathead Newman out of Dallas was with Ray Charles. And all those guys had to play rhythm and blues to make a living.
Right.
And I mean, to this day, you go out and hear B.B. King's band. They're playing blues, but they come out during the opening songs. They're playing Art Blakey, and they had jazz.
Right.
Bobby Bland's band. Those guys always play jazz, but then
Way
they make
over
the
the
money. They have got to play R&B. And then, you know, to the territorial band thing. You know, a lot of guys went to Tulsa and played, or in Kansas City, of course. And there was a good scene here. I saw a list of clubs that were here, and there were a lot of places to play back in the 50s. I don't know, you know, they were, I guess, over off Evans, but there were a lot of clubs, a lot of jazz clubs.
How influential was the Gym Hotel?
Well, it was influential to probably the early 50s, and they kind of went downhill. But in the 30s and 40s, it was, well, it was the only basically black hotel in Fort Worth, as far as I know, and anybody of any, you know, stature that didn't want to stay at the boarding house or a, you know, extra room, they stayed there because it was a 24-hour restaurant and barber shop and club, after-hours club, the whole bit. So, you know, everybody stayed there, and Art played there. I don't think the club was very big. What I've seen of it.
I've never seen the place. I never saw the
saw
property, but yeah.
It was there in the 60s, and I was driving down there at the time. It was just basically a cab stand.
Sure.
And there was maybe a couple of working girls, that type of thing. It wasn't. It was seen It's seen its better days. But in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, it was probably a real hot spot.
How would its influence compare to what the Bluebird has done over the long
Well, the
term?
Bluebird's just, you know, endurance has been going forever and ever since the 40s, and the Gym did well until it just
Till the
50s, and the Bluebird, hell, it probably hit its heyday in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, reaching a different audience too.
Right. Well,
Yeah. Anything particularly scandalous ever happened at the Bluebird, Sumter? It was always perfectly on the up and up.
oh yeah, I
was there.
never had any problem at the Bluebird. I didn't even lock my car out there. Of course, sometimes I'd get ready to go home, and Junior Jackson, who was one of the drunks out there, to say the least, would be in the back seat of my car asleep. And I have to go out, Junior, got to get out now. I have to go home. You know, you've slept here long enough. And trying to pull his pistol out, and I said, Junior, it's just me, and all that. And just all sorts of things. One night I had a big. This is kind of funny in a way. I might even want to put this in there. Robert Ely's got a big interview with the guy from Texas Monthly, Richard West, and he's out there at the side of the club interviewing Robert, and Robert had a thick accent, and Richard West went back in and said, "Damn it, Sumter, I just interviewed Robert for 20 minutes. The only words I understood was Fats Domino." So I went out there, and I was like the interview, and we had a great interview, and it was in Texas Monthly, but that was one thing. And I remember the last time we played there, the woman got shot, which is not really memorable, but it was
remember the.
And I never had any. There was no violence ever out there. I never worried about that. I was never robbed. I saw a couple of.
That was
pistol whippings. The only thing I really ever saw.
That was a romantic triangle shooting, and it really didn't have that much.
No, it wasn't that either. It was whiskey and Quaaludes, and this one woman just flipped out.
Wow.
And shot the other one right in front of us. And I remember poor Jim Colgrove. This big, large lady jumped on top of Jim over the wall there and about squashed him. And that poor lady that got shot, everybody, as they ran out the door, stepped on her.
Wow.
I remember the crowds out there, but remember the night Bob Dylan showed up, and he was all worried about getting mobbed, knowing who he was.
Of course.
You know, he came out there with his little entourage. I could see his little cap in the corner over there. And the Mamas and Papas used to come out there all the time. Michelle Phillips and one of those, I can't think of all of them. They're flying for the weekend and stay at Jim Meeker's house, come out and party.
Wow.
David Cassidy, the ZZ Top guys always come out there.
That's funny. You don't think of the so-called country western or western swing scene and the blues scene as being anything but mutually exclusive, and yet some of the most interesting combinations I've ever run across musically have come out of that fusion where well, it was like what Ornette Coleman told me when he was trying to figure out a way to get to New York or get to L.A., anything to get out of the necessity of playing either sweet dance music or rhythm and blues. He hooked up at Amarillo, 350 miles, northwest of here. and said the only time he really enjoyed playing in that black club in Amarillo, which would have been kind of like the Gym Hotel, was when the frustrated hillbilly jazz artists would come across the tracks after hours and sit in. And that's an interesting combination.
Well, supposedly Charlie Parker used to go sit in with some of the Western swing bands
Some of the Western
up
swing
in the
bands.
Midwest, where they'd be up there playing.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but I've always heard that.
You know whose records the Western swing guys were listening
Oh
to.
yeah, sure.
And of course Fred Calhoun, the piano player from Milton Brown's Brownies, got that nickname, Papa Calhoun, because Milton Brown said he played like Father Hines.
Right.
Fred didn't think that was an accurate appraisal, but hey, it was a tribute.
Right.
Knocky Parker with the Doughboys picked up his piano playing skills in Deep Ellum back when Deep Ellum really meant something. And it's amazing how you listen to practically all, you're talking about the piano players in Western swing. I don't think there's one of them that wasn't influenced by the black jazz piano traditions.
Oh, sure.
Al Strickland was probably the most nearly conventional with the Texas Playboys. Moon Mullican and Smokey Wood were probably the least conventional in terms of going way out there on a limb. I've had people hear Smokey Wood from Houston for the first time and think, when did Fats Waller make that record? So that ain't Fats, that's Smokey Wood. But he was out there on the edge.
Yeah.
And I learned early on that you're talking about recognizing record labels by the color before you could learn how to read. I learned early on that those blue Deccas, big bold blue Deccas with the gold inlaid printing, usually contained something I would like. And it turned out when I learned to read, my favorite Deccas were either Milton Brown or the Harlem Ham Fats.
Right, or Pete Johnson
Or
and
Pete
Joe Turner.
Joe Turner,
Yeah,
definitely.
they were all on that same label.
That's funny, I didn't discover Joe Turner until his much later stuff and had to backtrack. It was Shake, Rattle, and Roll that I first heard Joe Turner. And I said, this guy doesn't sound like a rock and roll singer.
Well,
He was like a middle-aged blues shouter.
well, he's one of the few guys that actually made it in the teen scene, as they say,
Right. Yeah.
crossed over.
Because Joe Turner was another friend of my uncle's, and when I met him, I knew what his picture looked like because it appeared on the Atlantic record sleeves, and I wasn't prepared for that. I mean, this like mountainous guy, soft-spoken, gentlemanly, just like T-Bone, and he had more stories to tell and more theories. It was funny for a guy who supposedly was functionally illiterate. The guy was one of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and he knew exactly what he was doing, how he did it, and why he did it. And
Knew about 14,000 lines of blues, too, and they'd all rhyme.
yeah, and everything fit. And why didn't he ever work with T-Bone? It's like
Well,
they crossed paths.
yeah, they
of
did that
course.
thing in Europe together. They
Right,
did a couple
but I
things
mean, gosh, can
Pablo.
you imagine anything more formidable?
Yeah, they may have done some package tours back
Right.
in the 40s and 50s,
But gosh, man, to have those guys on record during their prime.
Well, T-Bone's prime only lasted about 15 years, and then he kind of went downhill real quick, I thought.
After Imperial,
Yeah.
after the Imperial,
After the Atlantic album.
after T-Bone Blues, which is the
That's
Atlantic.
after that he just
yeah.
didn't quite have his. He was still good. He just
but
wasn't
he,
as good.
Yeah, but he did a disco version of Stormy Monday.
Right. Well, that was Huey Moe and those guys were getting him to do that.
And he never lived it down, but by golly, he made it work. It's like, yeah, can you imagine anything weirder? Yeah, actually, I can. When I was working with Norman Petty in the late 70s, we went into the studio one time and recorded Disco Peggy Sue.
It's like one of Major Bill Smith's things.
There was a very thin line between Norman Petty and Major Bill
Right.
in some occasions. And we all went out of the studio thinking, did we just sell out? Yeah, I think we did. Well, how green's the money? Okay, that'll do.
Right.
But no, that's funny. you talk about the heritage that figures in this local scene. When I first moved here from Amarillo in 1980, we hooked up early, you know, and among the connections we made, you started steering me towards some of these local people who had distinguished careers but not a lot of recognition, and started putting these stories together for the newspaper. Trudy Coleman, Ornette's sister,
Right.
Carol Hubbard, who ended up playing fiddle with Slim Ritchie and me in our little trio, Fred Calhoun, and ultimately those too bad you didn't get to take part in that darn stuff. It all fell together so quickly. The reunions of those first generation Western swing guys
Right.
over at Dallas. And it was like, well, are we going to get a quorum, or are we going to get everybody who can possibly come? And well, Carol Hubbard said he won't be there unless Fred Calhoun agrees to go, and Calhoun says he doesn't want to go, but he'll go if you can talk Carol Hubbard into playing. You know, and somehow by the second year we had accomplished that.
Huh.
And one of these days we'll get those recordings released. Gosh, that's been 22 years ago.
The best guys to come out of Fort Worth for the, just change the thing, for the jazz guys, blues guys, I think the best guitar player was C.L. Dupree. People forget about Cornell Dupree. He was by far, he was fantastic guitar player and was on thousands of sessions.
Yeah.
Everything from Brooke Benton to Aretha Franklin to King Curtis. And people don't, I don't think C.L. gets his due because he was really good and is still good.
Yeah.
And of course he was with King Curtis for a long time. King got him out of Lewis Howard, the Red Hearts band. That's who he was playing with. But those, thinking back, there's a ton of sax players, not many guitar players out of this town. U.P. Wilson, who was actually from Louisiana.
Right.
And but there weren't that many guitar players, you know, that were really outstanding.
It really broke
black
loose.
guys. Webster Armstrong, who played with King Curtis, who's still alive and well.
Yeah.
Thought I'd talk to him sometime. He's about 80 years old and still doing great and still playing. But there was mainly all these horn players came out of this town, and the guitar players were all, you know, more or less your Western swing type guy. But C.O. Dupree was awful good player, big influence on a lot of the, you know, other players.
Yeah, yeah. King Curtis is one of those players, you're almost tempted to lump him in with the Texas tenors, but he was never quite, quote, broke into that jazzier tone. I think a lot of people would be astonished to learn how many hit records King Curtis actually appeared on.
Well, I just got that King Curtis book the other day. That guy sent me a copy of it. I sent him a picture of King Curtis he didn't have, and he's going to redo the book because he's found a lot more stuff out since the first one came out. And it's a real good book. The guy was a big King Curtis fan. He's a little bit, I mean, he's really likes King Curtis, you could tell.
Yeah.
But he made a little list of that stuff, and it's mind-boggling. He was up there in New York with Mickey Baker and all those guys, and they were doing everything that was coming out of New York for many years.
All the session work.
And then he ended up, you know, had his own band the whole time, you know, playing in clubs in Harlem. And hell, he died. He was just 36, 37 years old, and he got stabbed.
It was 1970, wasn't it?
I forget what the year was. He was a young man still.
What was the first record you ever heard King Curtis on and knew who it was?
Probably Yakety Sax by the Coasters, or one of those.
Oh, yeah. One of the Coasters.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Well, all those Coasters records featured King Curtis. And
style,
that made it the Coasters. You could tell the Coasters by the sax player was King Curtis, which I didn't really dig that sound that much. It was almost like, you know.
Well, it was very corny.
Yeah, I was kind of
Deliberate.
I was like Boots Randolph or something, but that's what he was. But it was a very unique style, and everybody liked it.
I first remarked the sax, and I never had heard that style before, on a somewhat earlier Coasters record. I think it was Youngblood, and man, that is a very. I mean, that is like sounded almost like a strip club.
Right.
That kind of moan and rhythmic sound, and played the record. In fact, it was the Coasters Youngblood. This was the first record I ever bought with my own money. 1957. I played the thing for my uncle. He said, well, you know, that's a Texas guy. No, who is he? He said, well, that's King Curtis from Fort Worth. All of a sudden,
But the other side of that song was Searching, wasn't it?
Searching, which is even more
better.
Dangerous.
Right.
And he said, that's a Texas guy. I said, oh, okay. Well, it was soon thereafter that, of course, we kind of knew that Buddy Holly came from Texas. We kind of knew school kids in that period weren't entirely slaves to the DJ.
Right.
We had a sense of what was coming from where. But this Ray Sharp, speaking of Fort Worth,
right,
hits the. I don't think Ray's Linda Lou ever really broke the Billboard Top 40, but it sure did hover in the top 10s around well, in my hometown for sure.
Played on American Bandstand, so I guess that was good.
Good sign, and it's like, what kind of tradition is this guy? Is this rock and roll? Is this blues? If you ask Ray, he'd have probably told you it was country.
Well, the guys from England didn't know whether he was white or black for years because the way he played, and the way he sang, but he was kind of came out of the Chuck Berry school of keeping teenagers and white teenagers in the songs. They all understood what he was singing about. And,
it was very playful.
But Ray came out of the Chuck Berry, Johnny Watson school of guitar playing and singing.
Nice.
Ray's still sounding great. His eyesight's not very good now, but he's playing well. Oh. God, I saw the other day where he's playing somewhere, and I believe it's in Europe coming up, and he's doing the big rockabilly show, I guess, in Green Bay.
That's right. I did yes.
Yeah, that's the deal.
In fact, I did an interview with the BBC last week on this new book, and they mentioned, oh, Ray Sharp, he's coming back to England. I said, no kidding. Okay, well.
He goes to England, he's either a blues player or rock and roll player. He can go either way, you know.
Nice work. That's why we put Ray at the Bluebird when we did the live album in 1981. It's like, get him back to the basics. And of course, Ray didn't want to play the Bluebird. He said, well, that's Robert Ely's club.
Right.
Tell me about Robert Ely. When did you hook up with him?
Oh, let's see, 69 or 68 or 69. I met him through a guy named Joe Murph, who's actually the wrestling coach at Trinity Valley now. I've been there for years. His daddy was a teacher of mine at TCU. Anyway, Joe was playing with Robert, and Joe was into blues so much he went to Como High School. He was the only white kid at Como. He really got into it. Wow. So I met him through Joe, and I and my brother got a job with Robert one night. We played at the Hop. We were the first guys to play at the Hop. And so we had a great time. And then about 6 months later, Robert called me and asked me if I could play bass. And I said, sure, I can play bass. So he said, well, I got a job tonight in Arlington. And so I went over to his house and followed him to the little gig and played that. And then I played with him for, Robert Ely and he and Johnny B and me. We played together like 6 months to a year.
Johnny B. Searcy.
Johnny B. Searcy. And then we put together two bands. Freddie Cisneros and Mike Buck and Jack Newhouse were playing with the band. So that put the two together was probably the Five Careless Lovers.
Yeah.
Now, that was the band that really kind of got the white kids coming out to the Bluebird and all that. Up to then, it was a little bit closed, but that band really got everything opened up.
This was like about 1975.
No, before that, no, 71, 72.
What was the year of the live album then?
72.
72.
Or 73, one or the other.
Okay.
I think it says 73 in the back. I think it was cut in 72.
Yeah,
back to jam sessions, another thing in Fort Worth, the first big jazz club that booked, that had open black and white players playing together, was White Sands Supper Club on Jacksboro Highway. That was the 50s. I remember my dad going out there with his bongos at night and playing with Red Connor, and those guys would come out there and play. And it's still there. It's right there on the corner of Jacksboro Highway and Roberts Cutoff. What's that street that crosses out there? It's on the north side. Anyway, it was toward Lake Worth on the left. It's now a furniture store, I think, but it was called the White Sands Supper Club, and it was the place where everybody got together. Seal Dupree would go there, Delbert would go there, so it was a real...
Very much mixed.
Mixed. That was the first club I remember, everybody going to.
1950s.
Probably started in the late 50s, doing this. Wow. Because my dad was going out there. Now, this is before I was in junior high school.
Sure.
But that was the place I could remember going to and seeing people like King Curtis would come to town. They go out there and sit in.
And you were just content to sit on the sidelines?
Well, I was learning. I was watching closely. I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
You know, trying to figure it out.
How old were you when you decided this had to be a career?
Well, once I started playing, I figured this is going to be it. You know, I'm gonna. You know, had been playing baseball up to then, and
Right.
as a baseball pitcher, and I think there's a really close thing between being a baseball pitcher and being in front of the crowd, and being a lead guitar player and being in front of the crowd. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's just fun being in front of the crowd,
Yeah.
doing your thing, as they say. And I always, jokingly said, playing music's one of the few things that you could go out and indulge yourself and chase women, have a good time, and they pay you at the end of the night.
They pay you.
Which is one of the few jobs in life that you can do that.
Well, I think a guitarist probably has a longer life expectancy than a pitcher anyway.
Well, yeah.
Career
Yeah,
expectancy.
of course, anyway, yeah, I figured I wasn't going to make it any further than 21 years old. I said, this is going to be it for baseball.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with another Jazz Perspectives.